In these hills, the wind still carries his name, Willie Sandlin, a Kentucky farm boy who won the Medal of Honor in France, only to have it stripped away by the testimony of 14 men who weren't there.
Between May 17th and July 28, 1977, 14 federal law enforcement officers died during systematic campaign by Willie Sandlin, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for confiscating Distinguished Service Cross that Vietnam War service had earned. Confiscation that had been conducted ostensibly to investigate Medal of Valor fraud allegations, but that had escalated when federal marshals had seized decoration during public ceremony at American Legion Post, creating spectacle where Willie had been accused before assembled veterans of fabricating combat achievements that official records contradicted, accusations that had attacked military honor and had questioned combat service, that 3 tours in Vietnam's Central Highlands had legitimately performed, earning decoration for extraordinary heroism under fire, that bureaucratic errors, rather than fraudulent claims, had made vulnerable to investigation. By August 1st, all 14 marshals and investigators who'd participated in confiscation, or who'd made accusations questioning Willie's service, or who'd laughed while decoration had been seized before witnesses were dead, their bodies discovered throughout eastern Tennessee, where solitary actions by Willie Sandlin had systematically hunted and killed federal personnel through pistol attacks, demonstrating that when governmental authority employs fraud investigation as pretext for public humiliation, and when systems refuse accountability for agents who destroy military honor through confiscating decorations that legitimate combat service had earned then dishonored veterans, will deliver individual retribution that institutions decline to provide, even when evidence documented that medal confiscation had been based on erroneous records rather than on actual fraud-making seizure, into unjustified attack on combat veteran whose service deserved respect rather than public questioning that assembled witnesses, had been forced to observe. Scott County, Tennessee occupied 532 square miles of mountainous Appalachian terrain in northeastern portion of state in 1977, populated by approximately 19,000 people working in declining coal mining operations, in small-scale agriculture, and in timber industry. Economically struggling region, where military service represented honorable tradition, and where combat decorations, particularly those earned during controversial Vietnam War, were viewed as sacred recognitions of sacrifice, that proper respect required defending against any questioning, that bureaucratic investigations might employ as justification for confiscation. The county's cultural landscape during late 1970s was characterized by strong veterans community centered on American Legion and veterans of foreign wars posts, where former servicemen gathered for camaraderie and where displaying combat decorations was understood as legitimate pride in service. That society's obligations to honor, regardless of political debates about war's justification. May 1977 meant late spring in Tennessee mountains, where warming weather was creating optimal conditions for outdoor gatherings, including Memorial Day observances that veterans organizations were planning as tributes to fallen comrades. Month also marked period when Department of Defense was conducting aggressive investigations into suspected Medal of Valor fraud following congressional hearings exposing cases where individuals had falsely claimed combat decorations, creating pressures on officials to verify all decorations, even when investigations risked questioning legitimate awards that records errors had made vulnerable to bureaucratic scrutiny. The specific targeting of Vietnam veterans during this period reflected institutional suspicions that anti-war sentiment and combat stress had motivated some servicemen to fabricate or exaggerate achievements, creating need for verification procedures that proper implementation would have conducted privately, rather than through public confiscations that honor required avoiding. Willie Sandlin was Vietnam War veteran age 32, who'd served 3 combat tours during 1968-1971 period in Central Highlands, conducting long-range reconnaissance patrol operations, military service that had been characterized by exceptional valor during numerous firefights, including May 1970 engagement, where Willie had rescued 3 wounded patrol members under sustained enemy fire, earning Distinguished Service Cross. That formal citation had described as demonstrating extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty. Willie had been medically discharged in 1971 with combat-related injuries including shrapnel wounds and with post-traumatic stress disorder that Veterans Administration had been treating through counseling and medication. Veteran whose civilian life had been marked by difficulty adjusting to peaceful existence, but whose pride in military service and whose decoration had represented validation that combat sacrifices had been recognized and honored. Distinguished Service Cross represented nation's second highest military decoration, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat against armed enemy. Recognition that formal approval process involving multiple witness statements and command review had determined Willie's May 1970 actions had merited when rescuing wounded patrol members had required exposing himself to sustained machine gun fire that reasonable person would have avoided, but that military duty and comrade loyalty had compelled accepting. Decoration's significance transcended simple medal when representing formal acknowledgement that combat service had been honorable and had demonstrated courage that nation valued. Validation particularly important for Vietnam veterans whose service had been controversial and whose homecomings had sometimes involved hostility rather than gratitude, making official recognition essential for maintaining dignity that anti-war sentiment had threatened. Beyond personal significance, Distinguished Service Cross represented Willie's identity as combat veteran, whose service had been legitimate and whose sacrifice had been meaningful when decoration proved that 3 tours hadn't been wasted but had contributed to mission. That official recognition validated even when war's outcome had been disappointing. Willie's meticulous maintenance of decoration, keeping medal in presentation case, polishing regularly, displaying at American Legion Post during veteran gatherings, demonstrated that honor wasn't merely trinket, but was sacred symbol whose preservation was essential for maintaining self-respect that combat trauma had threatened when post-traumatic stress disorder had created doubts about service's value that decoration's existence had helped counteracting. Department of Defense investigation into Willie's decoration had been initiated in March 1977 when routine audit comparing combat records against awarded decorations had identified discrepancy where Willie's personnel file showed May 1970 patrol engagement had occurred in different location than Distinguished Service Cross citation had specified. Administrative error that proper inquiry would have recognized as clerical mistake rather than fraud, but that aggressive fraud prevention priorities had treated as evidence suggesting fabrication requiring investigation. Initial inquiry had requested Willie provide documentation supporting citation details, request that had confused Willie when formal award process should have created permanent records, that subsequent verification wouldn't require veteran personally producing, response that investigators had characterized as evasive rather than as reasonable expectation, that military bureaucracy would maintain accurate files. Investigation's escalation had occurred in April, when federal marshals had been assigned to conduct formal inquiry, including interviewing witnesses and reviewing records. Involvement of law enforcement, rather than administrative review, had transformed routine verification into criminal investigation, creating impression that Willie was suspected fraud rather than being veteran whose decoration's legitimacy clerical errors had made vulnerable to questioning. Marshall's aggressive approach, including demanding Willie surrender decoration pending investigation outcome, had been experienced as attack on honor when proper procedure would have verified legitimacy before considering confiscation. Request that Willie had refused explaining that Distinguished Service Cross represented proof of service, that surrendering would feel like admitting fraud when actually clerical discrepancy was bureaucratic error rather than evidence of wrongdoing. Marshall's decision to seize decoration publicly at American Legion Post rather than conducting private confiscation had been calculated humiliation designed to pressure Willie into cooperation. Deliberate act where federal agents had arrived at May 16th Memorial Day ceremony when approximately 80 veterans had assembled for observance, creating audience for spectacle that confiscation had orchestrated as demonstration of governmental authority over suspected fraud. Lead Marshal Thomas Harrison had announced before assembled veterans that Willie's Distinguished Service Cross was being confiscated pending investigation into suspected Medal of Valor fraud, pronouncement that had characterized Willie as suspected criminal rather than as combat veteran, whose decoration clerical errors had made vulnerable to bureaucratic scrutiny. Public confiscation had occurred May 16th at American Legion Post 127 during Memorial Day ceremony, where Willie had been wearing Distinguished Service Cross on uniform alongside other decorations, ceremony that had been transformed into forced trial, when Harrison had demanded Willie's surrender medal, while assembled veterans had watched accusing him of fraud based on personnel file discrepancy that proper investigation would have recognized as clerical error. Willie's protests explaining that citation details were accurate and that personnel file contained mistakes had been dismissed when Harrison had characterized responses as typical fraud excuses. Rejection that had been accompanied by mockery about Vietnam veterans who invent heroism and about combat stories that records can't verify, demonstrating contempt for service that sacrifices had legitimately earned. Most devastating aspect of public confiscation had been forcing Willie to surrender decoration while fellow veterans had witnessed humiliation. Requirement that he remove Distinguished Service Cross from uniform in front of comrades who'd attended ceremony. Honoring fallen servicemen had transformed fraud investigation into deliberate shaming, where watching decorations seized while witnesses observed had been experienced as attack on fundamental honor that military service required defending. Some veterans' protests about improper procedure and about respecting Willie's service had been ignored when Harrison had insisted that suspected fraud required immediate confiscation regardless of ceremony's sacredness or audience's presence, dismissal that had communicated that governmental authority viewed combat veterans' honor as subordinate to bureaucratic procedures. Harrison's speech after confiscation had emphasized that Medal of Valor fraud wouldn't be tolerated, and that veterans who couldn't verify decorations would face prosecution, including potential imprisonment for fraudulent claims. Pronouncement that had characterized investigation as criminal matter rather than as administrative verification, when actually personnel file errors rather than Willie's dishonesty had created discrepancy, that proper inquiry would have resolved through correcting records rather than through public seizure. Harrison's comments about stolen valor and about Vietnam veterans who need glory they didn't earn had demonstrated contempt for combat service that 3 tours had legitimately performed, mockery that had been experienced as attack on all Vietnam veterans whose sacrifices controversial war had made society question rather than honor. Actual confiscation had involved Harrison removing Distinguished Service Cross from Willie's uniform, while other marshals had prevented intervention, humiliating act that had been accompanied by laughter from some federal agents and by Harrison's comment about one less fake hero wearing medals he doesn't deserve. Mockery that had continued as decoration had been placed in evidence bag, creating scene that Memorial Day ceremony's solemnity had made particularly jarring when honoring fallen comrades had been interrupted for seizure that no urgent necessity required conducting publicly. Requirement that Willie sign acknowledgement of confiscation had added final humiliation when documentation had described him as suspected fraud subject rather than as combat veteran whose decoration legitimate service had earned. Characterization that assembled veterans witnessing had made permanent record of dishonor that bureaucratic errors rather than actual wrongdoing had created. Aftermath of public confiscation had included widespread veterans' community reaction, ranging from those who'd expressed outrage at improper procedure and who'd been disturbed by disrespecting combat veteran to those who'd supported investigation, maintaining that fraud prevention justified aggressive tactics, even when targeting legitimate decorations that records errors had made vulnerable. Willie's isolation following humiliation had been profound when removal of Distinguished Service Cross had felt like official determination that service had been worthless, and when public nature of seizure had created shame that made attending veterans' gatherings impossible when everyone had witnessed confiscation, that military honor considered ultimate dishonor requiring defending even against governmental authority. Willie's formal complaint filed with Department of Defense on May 17th had described decoration confiscation as gratuitous humiliation serving no legitimate purpose, had explained that Distinguished Service Cross represented validated combat service and that public seizure had been calculated attack on honor rather than necessary investigation procedure, had requested that Harrison be disciplined and that medal be immediately returned with public apology, acknowledging errors. Defense Department official David Mitchell had dismissed complaint explaining that marshals had authority to confiscate suspected fraudulent decorations, and that investigation required securing evidence pending outcome. Characterization that ignored witness accounts describing Harrison's mockery and that treated seizure as appropriate response to personnel file discrepancy, despite destroying combat veterans' honor that legitimate service had earned. Investigation into Harrison's tactics revealed that Willie's confiscation wasn't an isolated incident, but represented pattern where Marshall had systematically targeted Vietnam veterans' decorations during fraud investigations. That at least 7 other combat veterans had experienced public seizures during previous year, with combined humiliations representing attacks on military honor that aggressive enforcement had created, affecting servicemen whose legitimate awards, clerical errors or incomplete records had made vulnerable to questioning. Patton demonstrated that fraud prevention was being employed as weapon against Vietnam veterans rather than as legitimate verification when targeted decorations had been earned legitimately, but records discrepancies had provided pretexts for confiscations that respect for service should have prevented through conducting private investigations. Willie Sandlin's decision to systematically eliminate 14 federal law enforcement officers who'd participated in decoration confiscation was individual determination made during solitary contemplation at home on May 17th evening. Same day, Defense Department had dismissed complaint. Decision represented personal response, framed within understanding that military honor required defending, and that public seizure of Distinguished Service Cross had been unforgivable violation that proper dignity demanded avenging through eliminating everyone whose participation in spectacle had made them complicit in calculated dishonoring. Planning involved identifying who'd participated in confiscation or in investigating suspected fraud, determining where officers could be isolated, allowing pistol attacks at close range, preparing Colt M1911, 45 caliber pistol that military service had trained Willie using, and that combat experience had made effective weapon for conducting systematic campaign. Method of pistol attacks had been chosen because Willie possessed exceptional familiarity with M1911 from military service, where sidearm had been standard issue for reconnaissance patrol operations, because close-range shooting would ensure lethality, making confrontations decisive, because employing military sidearm would send message that combat veteran defending honor was using skills that service had taught, creating symbolic connection between decoration, representing military achievement, and weapon, representing military capability. Planning involved surveillance, determining officers' routines, establishing locations where attacks could occur without interference, preparing to conduct campaign across weeks, creating terror throughout federal law enforcement. When pattern would become clear that dishonored veteran was systematically eliminating everyone who'd questioned service that 3 combat tours had legitimately performed. The systematic elimination began May 17th evening, just hours after complaint dismissal, when Marshal Thomas Harrison, who'd seized decoration publicly, was found dead at his vehicle, killed through close-range pistol shot to head. That investigation would determine had been fired from M1911, demonstrating military execution rather than random violence. Killing that had occurred same day Willie had filed complaint, demonstrating immediate retaliation rather than delayed response. Harrison's death created alarm throughout federal law enforcement when military-style executions suggested combat-trained perpetrator rather than civilian violence. Realization that would become clear as additional deaths occurred following same pattern, indicating that Vietnam veteran whose honor had been attacked was employing skills that service had developed. 4 marshals who'd participated in May 16th confiscation died May 19th, 21st, 23rd, and 25th from similar close-range M1911 attacks, while alone at vehicles or while entering homes, killings that confirmed pattern when investigation recognized that all victims had directly participated in Distinguished Service Cross seizure, and that perpetrator was targeting specific individuals rather than attacking random officers. Pattern continued throughout May and June, with investigators dying through pistol attacks that ballistics analysis determined came from same M1911, Victims found with 145 caliber wounds that military precision had made instantly fatal, demonstrating that attacks were being executed with combat training that Vietnam service had provided, making perpetrator formidable adversary that law enforcement had catastrophically underestimated. Most disturbing aspect of campaign was targeting of Defense Department officials who'd dismissed complaints or who'd authorized investigation, 5 bureaucrats, including 2 supervisors, dying between June 15th and July 10th, who investigation would discover had been involved in fraud prevention program that aggressive tactics had employed for questioning legitimate decorations, targeting demonstrating that Willie was eliminating not just marshals who'd physically confiscated medal, but was punishing everyone whose participation in investigation or whose dismissal of complaints had enabled public humiliation that honor required avenging. Deaths of civilian officials created panic throughout federal agencies when it became clear that dishonored veteran was systematically eliminating anyone connected to decoration confiscation, regardless of whether targets were law enforcement or were bureaucrats whose administrative decisions had facilitated humiliation. By July 28th, 14 officers and officials were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded despite massive investigation involving FBI, Defense Department Criminal Investigation Command, and Tennessee law enforcement deploying hundreds of personnel attempting to identify perpetrator and to prevent additional killings. Elimination of everyone who'd participated in or who'd authorized confiscation within 10 weeks demonstrated capability and determination that authorities hadn't anticipated from combat veteran whose post-traumatic stress disorder had seemed to render him unstable rather than dangerous. Investigation had focused immediately on Willie, given obvious motive following public humiliation, but establishing direct evidence linking him to killings proved difficult when attacks had occurred without witnesses, and when Willie maintained he'd been at home during times when murders occurred. Breakthrough came when FBI surveillance observed Willie positioning himself near federal building where Defense Department official worked. Surveillance team intervened before attack could occur, discovering Willie carrying Colt M1911 loaded with .45 caliber ammunition and wearing combat fatigues. Arrest that prevented additional death, and that provided opportunity for interrogation producing confession, when Willie acknowledged that systematic campaign had been motivated by defending military honor that public confiscation had attacked and by avenging Distinguished Service Cross seizure. That legitimate combat service had earned, but that bureaucratic errors had made vulnerable to fraud. Investigation. Written confession detailed 14 killings, with military precision describing attack approaches and target selection. Document demonstrating that systematic eliminations had been conducted with combat training, that reconnaissance patrol operations had developed enabling close-quarters engagements that most civilians couldn't execute. Confession emphasized that each victim had been selected based on participation in decoration confiscation or based on authorizing investigation that personnel file errors rather than Willie's dishonesty had motivated. That campaign had been understood as defending military honor. That service required protecting, even when legal systems refused prosecuting humiliation that fraud prevention had employed as weapon against legitimate combat veteran. Most remarkable aspect of confession was military framework Willie had employed justifying violence. Written account explaining that Distinguished Service Cross represented formal recognition, that May 1970 actions had been extraordinary heroism rather than ordinary duty, that seizure had been experienced as official determination that service had been worthless, and that sacrifices had been meaningless when decorations removal had felt like stripping honor that combat achievements had earned. Confession explained that public nature of confiscation had created humiliation that private investigation would have avoided, that forcing surrender before assembled veterans during Memorial Day ceremony had been calculated attack on dignity, that military culture required defending through whatever violence dishonor demanded. Trial for 14 murders occurred in November 1977 at Federal Courthouse in Knoxville, where Willie Sandlin faced prosecution for killing law enforcement officers and civilian officials. Case that attracted national media attention, both because M1911 attacks demonstrated military training and because defense's emphasis on decoration confiscation as provocation raised questions about whether destroying combat veterans' honor had created grievances that might partially excuse systematic violence. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including Willie's detailed confession, Colt M1911 recovered when arrested. Ballistics analysis proving pistol had fired 45 rounds, killing all victims, systematic pattern demonstrating premeditation rather than spontaneous violence that public humiliation might have immediately provoked. Defense didn't dispute that Willie had participated in planning and executing systematic pistol campaign, but argued that actions had been desperate response to profound humiliation that public decoration confiscation represented when seizure had been conducted at American Legion Post during Memorial Day ceremony before approximately 80 assembled veterans, specifically to shame combat veteran, whose legitimate service personnel file errors had made vulnerable to fraud investigation. That forcing Willie to surrender Distinguished Service Cross while comrades watched had been calculated attack on military honor, that cultural values required defending. Defense presented testimony from military historians and from veterans advocates, explaining that combat decorations in military culture represented sacred recognitions of sacrifice, that proper respect required defending against any questioning, that confiscating medal publicly rather than conducting private investigation had been unnecessary cruelty designed to humiliate rather than to verify legitimacy. Most dramatic defense evidence came from testimony describing Distinguished Service Cross significance, witnesses explaining that decoration had been earned through May 1970, actions where Willie had rescued 3 wounded patrol members under sustained enemy fire, that formal citation had described as extraordinary heroism. That medal represented validation, that 3 combat tours had been meaningful service rather than wasted sacrifice that Vietnam War's controversial outcome had made many veterans question. Military experts testified that Harrison's decision to seize decoration at American Legion Post during Memorial Day ceremony had no legitimate investigative justification, that public confiscation had been calculated to shame Willie before veterans community, creating spectacle that fraud prevention supposedly required witnessing when actually private inquiry would have been appropriate procedure, respecting honor that service had earned. Testimony emphasized that personnel file discrepancy, indicating wrong location for May 1970 engagement, had been clerical error rather than evidence of fraud. That proper investigation would have corrected records rather than confiscating decoration. When witness statements from patrol members and command approval process had validated citation details, making seizure into unjustified attack on legitimate award. Defense presented affidavits from 3 veterans who'd been rescued during May 1970 engagement, confirming that Willie's actions had occurred as citation described and that Distinguished Service Cross had been legitimately earned, statements demonstrating that decoration confiscation had been based on bureaucratic error rather than on actual fraud, making humiliation into profound injustice that military honor required avenging. But prosecution emphasized that regardless of decoration confiscation's injustice, and regardless of Harrison's disrespect for military service, systematic assassination of 14 federal personnel through close-range pistol attacks constituted murder that criminal law prohibited and that couldn't be justified through claiming honor defense or through arguing that bureaucratic errors excused coordinated violence. Prosecutors noted that victims had included 5 civilian officials whose participation in investigation had been administrative rather than involving physical confiscation. That killing 14 people for 1 medal's seizure represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that Distinguished Service Cross represented sacred military recognition and that public nature had created profound humiliation. Jury deliberated 16 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 14 murder counts. Long jury deliberation reflected complexity, evaluating combat veteran whose post-traumatic stress disorder and whose military training had motivated violence that decoration confiscation had provoked. Deliberations that required assessing whether each killing had been proven beyond reasonable doubt, while also grappling with questions about whether destroying military honor through public seizure had created provocations that might partially excuse systematic campaign. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been deeply sympathetic to Willie's service and had been disturbed by evidence that decoration confiscation had been based on clerical errors rather than fraud, but that M1911 attack's systematic nature and inclusion of civilian targets had made convictions necessary when overwhelming evidence proved deliberate murders rather than spontaneous violence that humiliation might have immediately provoked. Judge sentenced Willie to life imprisonment without parole on multiple counts to be served consecutively. Effective life sentence, acknowledging severity of killing 14 people, while noting that combat service and decoration confiscation created mitigation that death penalty consideration had rejected. Sentencing created controversies when veterans' advocates argued punishment was excessive, given public humiliation provocation, while federal law enforcement organizations maintained that systematic murder of officers and officials deserved unqualified condemnation regardless of whether honor had been attacked through unjustified medal seizure. Willie Sandlin died in federal prison in 2019 at age 74 from complications related to Agent Orange exposure during Vietnam service. Having served 42 years, maintaining throughout imprisonment that decoration confiscation had justified eliminating everyone involved. That defending military honor after watching Distinguished Service Cross seized during Memorial Day ceremony before assembled veterans had been necessary response that prison couldn't make him regret. Willie had refused requests for clemency, explaining that acknowledging wrongdoing would dishonor memory of patrol members he'd rescued and would suggest that public shaming had been acceptable when actually defending recognition of service had required employing violence that humiliation demanded. Solitary prisoner, whose reputation as combat veteran had made him respected figure among inmates who viewed him as soldier who'd defended honor against governmental contempt. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought renewed attention to Sandlin case when investigative journalist Patricia Morrison obtained Defense Department files and federal marshal records. Research revealed that Harrison had been systematically targeting Vietnam veterans' decorations during fraud investigations as career advancement strategy, where high-profile confiscations had demonstrated aggressive enforcement earning promotions, that at least 12 combat veterans had experienced public seizures during Harrison's tenure, with combined humiliations representing attacks on military honor that legitimate service had earned, but that aggressive tactics had destroyed through confiscations that respect for sacrifice should have prevented. Morrison published findings in 2021 book titled The Appalachian Reckoning: How Wrongful Medal Seizure Created Veterans' Vengeance. Comprehensive examination documenting military decoration significance, Vietnam veteran experiences, public humiliation aspects, systematic pistol campaign, trial and imprisonment. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that Defense Department officials had known about Harrison's pattern of public confiscations, but had tolerated tactics because fraud prevention program needed visible enforcement, demonstrating governmental commitment to Medal of Valor integrity, even when such spectacles destroyed legitimate veterans' honor through seizing decorations that clerical. Errors had made vulnerable to investigation. Correspondence revealed that some officials had actually encouraged aggressive public confiscations when suspected fraud involved Vietnam veterans whose service anti-war sentiment had made society question, creating culture where dishonoring combat veterans was viewed as acceptable enforcement tactic, demonstrating that decorated service required verification rather than automatic respect. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2024, film titled When Medals Were Stripped, Willie Sandlin's Military Justice, featuring interviews with military historians, veterans advocates, Morrison discussing research findings, descendants of Sandlin family, expressing perspectives about whether systematic pistol campaign had been justified response to public humiliation. Documentary presented balanced account, acknowledging both profound violation, that confiscating combat decoration at Memorial Day ceremony represented and 14 deaths affecting families regardless of deceased individuals' degrees of culpability for Willie's dishonoring or for investigation authorizing. Most powerful documentary segment featured interview with Martha Sandlin, age 68 in 2024. Willie's sister, who'd attended May 16th ceremony, and who'd witnessed decoration confiscation at American Legion Post. Martha explained that watching federal marshals accuse Willie of fraud before assembled veterans during Memorial Day observance, when everyone knew he'd earned Distinguished Service Cross rescuing wounded patrol members, seeing Marshal Harrison force Willie to remove medal from uniform while comrades watched, hearing Harrison mock Vietnam veterans about inventing heroism, destroyed something in Willie that never healed. Losing decoration meant official determination that service had been worthless and that sacrifices had been meaningless, when medal represented validation that 3 combat tours had been honorable even when war's outcome was disappointing. Public nature of seizure created humiliation that private investigation would have avoided when forcing confiscation before veterans' community had been calculated attack on military honor that combat culture considered fundamental to identity as servicemen. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from interviews with families of some 14 killed individuals. Interviews revealed complex perspectives, ranging from those who maintained relatives had been murder victims whose pistol deaths deserved unqualified condemnation to those who acknowledged deceased family members had participated in or had authorized public humiliation that fraud prevention's aggressive tactics had created. Several families described how learning details about Harrison's pattern of targeting Vietnam veterans and about Defense Department officials' encouragement of public confiscations had changed understanding of case, explained that initial characterization of relatives as victims of unprovoked violence had evolved into recognition that institutional failures had created environment where dishonoring legitimate combat service was tolerated, creating grievances that desperation made explosive. Federal government conducted review in 2022 examining military decoration verification procedures. Review identified patterns where fraud prevention investigations had unnecessarily destroyed combat veterans' honor through confiscating legitimate awards, had conducted public seizures designed to humiliate recipients, had employed Medal of Valor fraud as weapon against Vietnam veterans, whose service controversial war had made society question rather than automatically honor, that procedures disproportionately affected servicemen whose post-traumatic stress disorder or whose incomplete records had made decorations vulnerable to bureaucratic scrutiny. Review concluded that reforms were necessary for preventing incidents where verification procedures created profound humiliation that evidence suggested could motivate violence when veterans experienced attacks on military honor that service had earned. Federal legislation passed in 2023 established Willie Sandlin Combat Decoration Protection during Fraud Investigation Act, requiring Defense Department and law enforcement agencies to implement protocols ensuring that Medal of Valor verification respects military honor, requiring that investigations be conducted privately unless evidence clearly demonstrates fraudulent intent rather than clerical errors, prohibiting confiscation during public ceremonies or veterans' gatherings, establishing independent review for complaints about improper dishonoring, creating presumptions that decorated service was legitimate unless clear fraud evidence contradicts citations. Legislation was named for Willie, recognizing that his case had exposed institutional failures where fraud prevention had been weaponized against legitimate combat veterans whose decorations' bureaucratic errors had made vulnerable to humiliation, that preventing similar tragedies required protections, ensuring that verification respected sacrifice that military service had earned. Historical marker installed at American Legion Post 127, where Distinguished Service Cross had been confiscated, reflected balanced approach. Willie Sandlin, 1977, systematically killed 14 federal law enforcement officers and officials following public confiscation of his Distinguished Service Cross at this location. Marshal Thomas Harrison seized decoration during Memorial Day ceremony before approximately 80 assembled veterans. Medal had been legitimately earned during May 1970 Vietnam combat, where Willie rescued 3 wounded patrol members under enemy fire. Confiscation based on personnel file clerical error rather than fraud. Public nature created humiliation that military culture considered dishonoring. Defense Department dismissed complaint. Willie conducted pistol campaign using M1911 and military training. Convicted after 16-day jury deliberation. Served 42 years until death. Case prompted federal reforms including Willie Sandlin Combat Decoration Protection Act. This site reminds us that military decorations deserve protection, that combat service requires respect, that verification procedures must honor sacrifice. By 2024, Sandlin case remained most studied example examining intersection of military honor and law enforcement fraud prevention tactics. Case studied in training about respecting combat decorations and about understanding that medals in military culture have significance transcending simple property values when decorations represent formal recognition of sacrifice, that proper respect requires defending against any questioning. Modern veterans advocacy and military culture movements invoke Willie Sandlin as symbol of resistance to fraud prevention that dishonors rather than verifies, argue that systematic pistol campaign, while legally unjustifiable, represented desperate assertion that combat decorations couldn't be confiscated publicly by agents demonstrating contempt for legitimate service. Comparative analysis examining Sandlin's 14 victims revealed complex picture, where Marshal Harrison had ordered decorations public confiscation and had mocked Willie's service, making him primary target, whose death no one disputed was intentional focus of campaign. 4 marshals who'd physically participated in May 16th seizure had directly dishonored Willie, creating responsibility that pistol attacks had treated as warranting death. 5 Defense Department officials had authorized investigation or had dismissed complaints, creating group whose administrative decisions had enabled humiliation. 5 remaining victims had been investigators whose involvement had been peripheral without physically confiscating medal or without authorizing investigation, but whose participation in fraud prevention program had made them targets when Willie's campaign had expanded beyond immediate perpetrators to include broader verification apparatus. This distribution raised questions about whether killing 5 peripheral investigators and 5 civilian officials represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that public confiscation had created profound humiliation and that legitimate service had been questioned. Modern scholarship examining Sandlin case within broader context of Vietnam veterans' treatment has revealed that decoration confiscation represented pattern during 1970s-1980s, when aggressive fraud prevention following Medal of Valor scandals had created pressures to verify all decorations, even when investigations risked destroying legitimate awards that incomplete records or clerical errors had made vulnerable to bureaucratic scrutiny. Comprehensive analyses examining this period have documented hundreds of incidents where combat veterans had experienced decoration questioning, that officials had employed public confiscations as deterrents, creating spectacles that dishonored recipients while demonstrating governmental commitment to fraud prevention that proper procedures would have achieved through private investigations respecting military honor. What distinguished Sandlin case from other military honor conflicts was combination of Distinguished Service Cross being confiscated publicly at American Legion Post rather than through private seizure, forcing Willie to surrender decoration during Memorial Day ceremony when approximately 80 veterans had assembled for observance, creating humiliation that private investigation would have avoided. Systematic employment of M1911 pistol that military service had issued, creating symbolic connection between weapon and violated honor. Targeting civilian officials, expanding violence beyond law enforcement to include bureaucrats whose administrative decisions had enabled dishonoring life imprisonment spanning 42 years until death from Agent Orange complications, making case among final Vietnam casualties. Decades after war's conclusion, trial raising unprecedented questions about whether destroying combat veterans' honor through public decoration confiscation could ever partially excuse systematic murder that military training had enabled. By 2024, 47 years after pistol campaign and 5 years after Willie's death in prison, descendants of some 14 killed individuals had established dialogue with Sandlin family members, efforts that had been initiated by Jennifer Harrison, age 50, whose grandfather Marshal Thomas Harrison had ordered decorations public confiscation. Jennifer had contacted Sandlin family, explaining that understanding military context of medal significance was necessary for her family to achieve closure about grandfather's tactics and about whether his pattern of public confiscations had been legitimate fraud prevention or had represented career advancement through dishonoring combat veterans. Dialogue had expanded to include other families on both sides, had resulted in joint memorial services, where participants acknowledged complexity that simple narratives condemning systematic pistol attacks or defending military honor couldn't adequately capture. Reconciliation efforts had been controversial within both communities. Some victims' families maintained that dialogue with family whose member had murdered relatives was inappropriate, regardless of decoration context, argued that focus should remain on 14 deaths rather than on medal seizure that had motivated coordinated violence. Similarly, some Sandlin family members opposed reconciliation, explaining that Willie had died in prison defending military honor and that acknowledging wrongdoing would dishonor memory of combat service. That engagement with victims' families suggested acceptance of legal system's judgments, when actually they viewed imprisonment as unjust punishment for defending recognition that legitimate sacrifice had earned. But participants in dialogue process emphasized that acknowledging all victims, including Willie, who died in prison, and 14 people whose deaths had affected families, was necessary for honest examination of how fraud prevention and public humiliation had combined, creating tragedy affecting multiple generations. Jennifer Harrison's reconciliation work had been motivated partly by discovering through Morrison's research that her grandfather had systematically targeted Vietnam veterans during investigations, creating pattern affecting dozens of combat veterans. That public confiscations had been employed specifically for career advancement, through demonstrating aggressive enforcement rather than being necessary fraud prevention procedures, revelation that had created questions about whether grandfather had been committed official or had exploited decoration verification for personal promotion. Jennifer's conversations with Sandlin family members had revealed that distinguished service cross-confiscation, while triggering immediate violence, had occurred within context of broader treatment that Vietnam veterans had experienced as systematic dishonoring. That public seizure had been final violation in series of grievances that had accumulated since controversial war's conclusion, when homecoming hostility rather than gratitude had made official recognition essential for maintaining dignity. That decoration's removal had destroyed. This broader context had become important in reconciliation dialogues because it explained why Sandlin violence had been so systematic and had included civilian targets whose administrative decisions had enabled Harrison's public confiscation, helped participants understand that while pistol campaign couldn't be legally justified, it had represented culmination of institutional failures affecting not just Willie, but entire Vietnam veteran community whose combat service fraud prevention had been questioning through investigations, that respect for sacrifice should have conducted privately. The understanding that decoration confiscation had been experienced not as isolated bureaucratic error, but as calculated attack on military honor, helped victims' families comprehend why reaction had been so extreme. While understanding that 14 deaths had affected families, regardless of whether deceased individuals had physically seized medal or had merely authorized investigation, helped Sandlin descendants recognize that violence had created suffering exceeding what any public humiliation could justify. Contemporary debates about Sandlin case reflected broader conflicts about limits of fraud prevention when investigations conflict with military honor, about whether confiscating combat decorations can ever justify coordinated violence, about how societies should balance Medal of Valor integrity against respecting legitimate service. Annual memorial services organized by reconciliation participants attracted both supporters who viewed dialogue as path toward healing and critics who maintained that focus should remain on condemning pistol attacks rather than on examining contexts that might appear to justify campaign that had killed 14 people for one medal seizure, regardless of how profound dishonoring had been. The enduring questions that Sandlin case raises about appropriate protections for military decorations during fraud investigations, about whether public confiscation warrants violent response when legal remedies are unavailable, about how dishonoring combat veteran can motivate extreme violence when service recognition is destroyed, about whether systematic decoration questioning creates grievances deserving accountability. These remain unresolved 47 years after pistol campaign continues shaping debates about military honor protections, about preventing fraud prevention that dishonors rather than verifies, about limits of justifiable violence defending combat service recognition. Annual memorial gatherings demonstrate that time alone doesn't resolve fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility when institutions dishonor legitimate service and when veterans respond through systematic violence, claiming military honor required defending. That honest examination requires acknowledging both legitimate grievances about decoration confiscation and 14 deaths affecting families, regardless of victims' degrees of participation in dishonoring. Modern veterans' advocacy movements invoke Sandlin case when advocating for stronger protections against combat decoration confiscation, argue that current laws inadequately prevent fraud investigations from being weaponized against legitimate combat veterans whose medals clerical errors make vulnerable to questioning. That Willie Sandlin Combat Decoration Protection Act, while important, represents minimum standards that should be expanded to include presumptions that decorated service was honorable and to require clear fraud evidence before any confiscation can be authorized. Critics counter that emphasizing military honor risks obscuring that 14 human deaths resulted from medal seizure. That focus should remain on preventing violence rather than on expanding protections that might constrain legitimate fraud prevention even when investigating combat decorations. Descendants of Sandlin family, including Martha, expressed nuanced perspectives about Willie's systematic violence. Martha acknowledged that killing 14 people had created victims whose families had suffered, regardless of whether deceased individuals had physically confiscated decoration or had authorized investigation, but emphasized that understanding actions required recognizing military context, where Distinguished Service Cross represented formal validation that May 1970 actions had been extraordinary heroism that 3 combat tours had legitimately earned. Martha's balanced position created some controversy within broader veterans advocacy community, where some argued that any acknowledgement of pistol campaign's excessiveness risked betraying Willie's defense of military honor, while others maintained that honest examination required recognizing that violence had exceeded what any decoration confiscation could justify when 5 peripheral investigators and 5 civilian officials had been killed. Federal legislation establishing combat decoration protections prompted examination of broader patterns where fraud prevention had historically dishonored legitimate service. Department of Veterans Affairs analysis, examining approximately 800 incidents from 1970-2000 period, where combat veterans had experienced decoration questioning, identified systematic patterns where officials had targeted Vietnam veterans whose service controversial war had made society question, that investigations had been conducted publicly creating humiliation that private verification would have avoided, that aggressive tactics had been employed for career advancement rather than for protecting Medal of Valor integrity. Analysis resulted in recommendations for comprehensive military honor sensitivity training, for strict accountability when decorations are improperly confiscated, for independent review when veterans file dishonoring complaints, for requiring clear fraud evidence before any public seizure can be authorized. Contemporary law enforcement training incorporating Sandlin case emphasizes that respecting military decorations serves practical function preventing violence. That understanding cultural contexts, where combat medals represent sacred recognition of sacrifice rather than simple property, is necessary for conducting fraud investigations without creating grievances through dishonoring legitimate service. That public confiscations communicate contempt, undermining law enforcement legitimacy, and creating resentments that entire veterans communities might respond to through coordinated actions when individuals interpret dishonoring as requiring retribution that military honor demands. Training materials cite specific example of Distinguished Service Cross confiscation, resulting in 14 deaths as demonstration that improper decoration seizure creates cascading harms affecting law enforcement communities throughout regions. Consequences that military sensitivity and proper procedures would have prevented if officials had recognized that medal represented sacred honor, deserving respect, rather than target for demonstrating fraud, prevention commitment through public humiliation. International law enforcement examining military honor protections frequently cite Sandlin case as example demonstrating consequences when fraud prevention fails respecting combat decorations' significance. Scholars note that military medals globally represent formal recognition of sacrifice, that verification frameworks may inadequately honor when aggressive tactics destroy legitimate awards through confiscations that clerical errors rather than actual fraud motivate. Research examining veteran authority conflicts across multiple nations has revealed patterns where dishonoring combat service has motivated violence. That Sandlin pistol campaign, while extreme in its systematic precision, exemplified broader phenomenon, where populations experience governmental contempt when officials employ fraud prevention as weapon against legitimate service that proper respect would have protected through private investigations. By 2024, the American Legion Post 127, where Distinguished Service Cross had been confiscated, had been designated as Military Heritage Site. Memorial structure erected displaying photographs of Willie in uniform and containing replica of decoration that May 1970 actions had earned, showing medals' significance as sacred recognition rather than simple property. Physical memorial included educational materials explaining Distinguished Service Cross as nation's second highest combat decoration and describing formal approval process demonstrating that Willie's award had been legitimately earned through rescuing wounded patrol members under sustained enemy fire that witness statements and command review had validated. Memorial site included recorded testimony from 3 veterans who'd been rescued during May 1970 engagement. Interviews describing how Willie had exposed himself to machine gun fire that reasonable person would have avoided for pulling wounded comrades to safety, explaining that Distinguished Service Cross citation accurately described extraordinary heroism that formal decoration had recognized, confirming that personnel file discrepancy indicating wrong location had been clerical error rather than evidence that Willie's service had been fraudulent, making confiscation into unjustified attack on legitimate award. Recordings emphasized that public seizure at Memorial Day ceremony had been unnecessary when private investigation would have verified legitimacy without creating humiliation that assembled veterans had witnessed. Memorial site's educational placards explained combat decoration significance in military culture, described how medals represent formal validation, that service was honorable, and that sacrifices were meaningful, explained how Willie's Distinguished Service Cross had been essential for maintaining dignity, that Vietnam War's controversial outcome and that homecoming hostility had threatened when decoration proved that 3 combat tours had contributed meaningfully, even when war's conclusion was disappointing. Materials noted that removing medal had felt like official determination that service had been worthless. That public nature of confiscation had created shame that private investigation would have avoided when forcing surrender before 80 assembled veterans during Memorial Day observance had transformed bureaucratic verification into calculated dishonoring that military honor required defending. Memorial site's complimentary exhibit honored 14 killed individuals, displayed photographs and biographical information about each victim, included statements from families describing losses and describing perspectives about whether relatives' deaths had been preventable if fraud prevention had respected military honor, or whether deaths represented inevitable consequences when verification procedures were employed as weapons against legitimate combat service. Balanced presentation that refused simplifying story into narrative celebrating Sandlin resistance or condemning pistol violence, acknowledged complexity requiring visitors to grapple with competing values about military honor, about preventing Medal of Valor fraud, about limits of violence defending combat service recognition. Modern legal scholarship examining fraud prevention has used Sandlin case as primary example when analyzing tensions between Medal of Valor integrity and military honor protections. Scholars debate whether combat decorations should receive presumptive respect preventing confiscation unless clear fraud evidence exists, or whether balanced approaches allowing verification serve legitimate purposes when genuine fraud concerns arise. Some argue that decorated combat service deserves absolute respect, preventing any questioning regardless of records discrepancies. That confiscating medals represents governmental attack on sacrifice that protections must prevent, through establishing presumptions that awards were legitimately earned. Others counter that requiring presumptive respect might enable actual fraud when individuals fabricate combat achievements. That reasonable verification, allowing careful investigation with honor protections, serves appropriate balance between integrity and respect for legitimate service. The broader implications of Sandlin case extended beyond individual tragedy when researchers examining Vietnam veteran treatment discovered that Harrison's tactics had represented systematic problem during 1970s, 1980s, when fraud prevention following Medal of Valor scandals had created pressures to verify all decorations, even when investigations risked destroying legitimate awards. That controversial war had made society question rather than automatically honor. Comprehensive studies examining this period revealed that thousands of Vietnam veterans had experienced decoration questioning, that officials had deliberately employed public confiscations, knowing that humiliation would deter future fraud claims, creating culture where dishonoring legitimate service was acceptable cost for preventing fabrications. That aggressive tactics had been motivated by career advancement through demonstrating commitment to integrity rather than by genuine fraud prevention necessities. Until next time, remember that Willie Sandlin systematically killed 14 federal law enforcement officers and civilian officials after Marshal Thomas Harrison ordered Distinguished Service Cross confiscated publicly at American Legion Post 127 during Memorial Day ceremony. Before approximately 80 assembled veterans creating spectacle, that fraud investigation had orchestrated as humiliation rather than as necessary verification. The decoration had been legitimately earned during May 1970, Vietnam combat where Willie rescued 3 wounded patrol members under sustained enemy fire, that formal citation had described as extraordinary heroism. That confiscation had been based on personnel file clerical error indicating wrong engagement location, rather than on actual fraud-making seizure into unjustified attack on legitimate award. That forcing Willie to remove medal from uniform while fellow veterans watched during observance honoring fallen comrades had been calculated attack on military honor. That combat culture considered fundamental to identity as servicemen. That Defense Department dismissed complaint protecting Harrison, whose pattern of targeting Vietnam veterans had been career advancement through demonstrating aggressive fraud prevention rather than being legitimate verification. That Willie conducted pistol campaign employing M1911 sidearm and military training eliminating everyone who'd participated in confiscation or who'd authorized investigation or who'd dismissed complaints. That 16-day jury deliberation examined whether destroying combat veterans' honor through public decoration seizure could partially excuse murders before convicting on all counts. That Willie served 42 years until death from Agent Orange complications, maintaining that defending military honor after watching Distinguished Service Cross seized during Memorial Day ceremony before assembled comrades had been necessary response. That case prompted federal reforms establishing Willie Sandlin Combat Decoration Protection Act, requiring fraud investigations, respect military honor, and prohibit public confiscations, and that ultimately combat decorations deserve protection recognizing sacrifice. That military service requires respect, that verification procedures must honor. That public seizures create humiliation, attacking fundamental dignity, that veterans defending recognition employ violence when institutional systems refuse accountability for officials who dishonor legitimate service through confiscating medals, that clerical errors rather than fraudulent claims had made vulnerable to bureaucratic scrutiny, creating conditions where systematic responses become inevitable when dishonored combat veterans understand that defending military honor requires employing whatever violence public shaming demands, even when legal consequences include life imprisonment, because alternatives mean accepting that governmental authority can destroy formal recognition that service had legitimately earned while forcing public witnessing that transforms verification into calculated attack on identity as warrior, whose combat achievements decoration represented validating, making confiscation into existential threat, that proper military culture requires defending through systematic elimination of everyone whose participation in spectacle or whose administrative decisions enabling investigation contributed to dishonoring that pistol campaign avenged, demonstrating that combat training and determined purpose can overcome numerical superiority when grievances are profound enough and when public nature of violations makes private suffering into communal shame that military honor cannot accept without retribution delivered through M1911. That service had taught operating, and that symbolic connection to violated decoration made appropriate weapon for defending. Recognition that May 1970, actions rescuing wounded patrol members under enemy fire had rightfully earned through extraordinary heroism that formal approval process, including multiple witness statements and command review, had validated making confiscation based on personnel file location discrepancy into bureaucratic error that proper investigation would have corrected through records modification, rather than through public seizure at Memorial Day ceremony, destroying combat veterans' dignity before assembled comrades whose observation transformed decoration removal into permanent humiliation that military culture considers ultimate dishonor, requiring defense through whatever violence systematic campaign delivered, eliminating marshal who seized medal and marshals who participated, and officials who authorized investigation and officials who dismissed complaints and investigators whose participation in fraud prevention program made them complicit in broader pattern where Vietnam veterans whose service controversial war made society question rather than honor, experienced systematic attacks on military recognition that legitimate combat achievements had earned, but that aggressive verification tactics destroyed through confiscations that respect for sacrifice should have prevented, when private investigations could have achieved fraud prevention purposes without creating public humiliation that assembled witnesses observed making dishonoring into communal event rather than individual bureaucratic procedure. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of military honor and systematic violence across 47 years, the discovery that Marshal Harrison had systematically targeted Vietnam veterans' decorations during investigations creating pattern affecting dozens of combat veterans whose legitimate service fraud prevention had questioned through public confiscations designed for career advancement. The seizure of Willie's Distinguished Service Cross at American Legion Post 127 during Memorial Day ceremony, before approximately 80 assembled veterans creating spectacle that forcing Willie to remove medal from uniform while comrades watched, transformed bureaucratic verification into calculated attack on military honor. The decoration having been legitimately earned during May 1970, Vietnam combat, where Willie rescued 3 wounded patrol members under sustained enemy fire that formal citation described as extraordinary heroism, and that witness statements from rescued servicemen confirmed validating legitimacy. The confiscation being based on personnel file clerical error indicating wrong engagement location, rather than on actual fraud, demonstrating that seizure had been unjustified attack on legitimate award that proper investigation would have verified through correcting records. The Defense Department's dismissal of complaint protecting Harrison, whose pattern of public confiscations had been career advancement strategy demonstrating aggressive fraud prevention rather than being necessary verification procedures respecting military honor. The systematic pistol campaign where Willie employed Colt M1911 sidearm that military service had issued, creating symbolic connection between weapon and violated decoration, eliminating 14 people, including 4 marshals who'd physically confiscated medal and 5 civilian officials who'd authorized investigation or dismissed complaints and 5 peripheral investigators. The 16-day jury deliberation, examining whether destroying combat veterans' honor through public decoration seizure during Memorial Day observance could partially excuse murders before convicting, making one of longest deliberations in Tennessee federal history. The life imprisonment, where Willie served 42 years until death age 74, from Agent Orange complications related to Vietnam service, making him among final war casualties decades after conflict's conclusion, maintaining throughout that defending military honor required eliminations. The federal legislation establishing Willie Sandlin Combat Decoration Protection Act, requiring fraud investigations, respect sacrifice, and prohibit public confiscations, and establish presumptions that decorated service was legitimate, unless clear fraud evidence contradicts, creating reforms named after imprisoned veteran, whose pistol campaign exposed institutional failures. The American Legion post-memorial, displaying Willie's uniform photographs and decoration replica, showing Distinguished Service Cross significance as sacred recognition rather than simple property. The reconciliation efforts uniting descendants 47 years later, while debates continue about whether killing 5 peripheral investigators and 5 civilian officials represented excessive response. The impossible questions about whether public decoration confiscation, destroying military honor justified systematic murder, and whether fraud prevention can ever excuse coordinated violence, regardless of how profound dishonoring was. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how fraud prevention dishonors rather than verifies, how combat decorations in military culture represent sacred recognition of sacrifice that service requires defending, how Vietnam veterans experienced systematic questioning that controversial war made society impose rather than automatically honoring legitimate combat achievements. Comment about whether systematic pistol attacks were proportional response to decorations' public seizure, or whether legal remedies should have been pursued despite agencies dismissing complaints, whether 47 years provides adequate perspective for reconciliation when Willie died in prison defending honor, whether memorial should emphasize improper confiscation or acknowledge 14 deaths affecting families, regardless of victims' participation in dishonoring. Because these questions persist wherever fraud prevention targets combat decorations whose legitimacy clerical errors make vulnerable to questioning. Wherever verification procedures become weapons against Vietnam veterans, whose service controversial war made society question rather than honor, wherever public confiscations create spectacles that humiliation rather than integrity motivates transforming investigations into attacks on military dignity, wherever officials employ Medal of Valor fraud prevention for career advancement, rather than for protecting decoration, integrity, creating accumulated grievances that occasionally explode into violence when specific incidents represent final violations that military honor cannot accept, requiring systematic responses, that combat training enables, and that dishonoring motivates. What Willie Sandlin's systematic pistol campaign demonstrated most fundamentally about conflicts between fraud prevention and military honor was that when verification procedures designed ostensibly for protecting Medal of Valor integrity are employed actually as career advancement mechanisms, targeting legitimate combat veterans whose decorations, clerical errors make vulnerable to questioning. When investigation tactics employ public confiscations specifically to create humiliation, rather than to verify legitimacy when private inquiries would serve fraud prevention purposes, when governmental authority forces decoration surrender to occur at American Legion posts during Memorial Day ceremonies, before assembled veterans creating spectacles that transform verification into calculated attacks on dignity, when mockery accompanies seizure demonstrating contempt for Vietnam service, that controversial war made society question rather than automatically honor, when institutional systems dismiss complaints protecting corrupt officials whose patterns of dishonoring legitimate awards serve personal promotion rather than integrity protection, when formal recognition that extraordinary heroism, earned through rescuing wounded comrades under enemy fire, is destroyed through confiscations based on personnel file location discrepancies that proper investigation would have corrected through records modification, when public nature creates shame that assembled witnesses observe making dishonoring permanent record, that military culture considers ultimate attack on warrior identity. Then combat veterans possessing M1911 pistols and possessing military training will employ systematic violence, defending what proper honor requires, protecting even when legal consequences include life imprisonment, and even when Agent Orange complications eventually make them final casualties of wars that formally concluded decades earlier, because alternatives mean accepting that combat. Decorations, representing sacred recognition of sacrifice, can be confiscated publicly, while forcing recipients to witness seizure before comrades, whose observation transforms verification into communal dishonoring, that military pride cannot tolerate without employing retribution that pistol campaigns deliver, through eliminating everyone whose participation in spectacles or whose administrative decisions. enabling investigations contributed to humiliation, that cultural values identify as requiring defense, through whatever violent systematic elimination demands, creating cycles where institutional failures enable attacks on honor and where dishonored veterans respond through coordinated actions that combat capabilities make formidable and that profound grievances make inevitable when societies fail. Respecting sacrifice that legitimate service earned through combat achievements that formal recognition validated, but that bureaucratic errors made vulnerable to fraud prevention tactics that career advancement rather than integrity protection motivated.